The Zephyrian homeworld was dying, and it wasn't dying quietly. Picture this. An entire planet of 30 million insectoid beings watching their sun flicker like a dying light bulb. Their ancient star, which had burned steady for billions of years, was now hiccuping its way toward total collapse. The scientists on Zephyr Prime had run the numbers over and over, hoping for a miracle that never came. 18 months. That's all they had left before their world became a frozen rock drifting through space. These weren't primitive creatures either. The Zephyrians had built cities that stretched across continents, developed technology that could bend space and time, and created art that would make humans weep with its beauty. They had families, children playing in crystalline gardens, elderly beings sharing stories under the pale light of their failing sun. But none of their advanced technology could fix a dying star. You can't negotiate with physics, and you can't repair a stellar core that's been burning for eons. So they did what any desperate civilization would do when facing extinction. They screamed into the void, their most powerful quantum beacon, a device that took decades to build and consumed enough energy to power entire cities, fired up for what might be its final transmission. The message shot across space faster than light itself, carrying the mathematical poetry of a dying race to every corner of the galaxy. The signal was beautiful in its simplicity. Help us, please. We are dying and we have children. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting and, frankly, a little depressing. Every major power in the galaxy heard that cry. We're talking about civilizations so advanced they could probably fix a dying star before lunch. The hegemony, those cold-hearted bureaucrats who controlled half the known galaxy, received the transmission within hours. They fed it into their massive computers, ran cost-benefit analyses, and calculated resource expenditure versus potential returns. The verdict? Not worth it. 30 million lives didn't register as significant enough to justify the expense. They filed a message under acceptable losses and moved on to more profitable ventures. The Crystalline Collective, beings of pure living mineral who appreciated beauty above all else, thought the signal was absolutely gorgeous. The way the Zephyrians had encoded their desperation into quantum fluctuations was, in their opinion, a masterpiece of artistic expression. They spent weeks analyzing its aesthetic properties, writing poetry about its mathematical elegance, and then carefully archived it in their vast libraries of beautiful but impractical things. They never once considered actually helping. Then there were the machine minds of Proxima, artificial intelligences so advanced they transcended physical form centuries ago. They processed a Zephyrian plea in nanoseconds, cross-referenced it against their extensive databases, and determined that interfering with natural stellar evolution would violate their core programming. Non-interference was their prime directive, and the death of an entire species was just nature taking its course. They logged the transmission and returned to contemplating the universe's mathematical perfection. Species after species heard that desperate cry for help. The Void Walkers, who could travel between dimensions, considered the message an interesting curiosity, but nothing more. The Eternal Empire, masters of time manipulation, briefly discussed whether temporal interference might be warranted, then decided it would create too many paradoxes. The Hive Queens, collective minds controlling billions of drones, calculated that helping the Zephyrians would set a dangerous precedent of expectation throughout the galaxy. One by one, every great civilization in the galaxy heard that plea and chose silence. They had reasons, of course, always reasons. Economic factors, political considerations, technological limitations, philosophical objections. The galaxy was full of rational actors making logical decisions based on careful analysis of risk and reward. But there was one species that apparently hadn't gotten the memo about being practical. One young civilization that had barely figured out how to travel between stars without blowing themselves up in the process. A species that still used primitive chemical rockets and had only recently developed faster-than-light communication. They were newcomers to the galactic community, barely noticed by the great powers, considered primitive and emotionally unstable by most standards. These creatures had a strange habit of doing incredibly stupid things for complete strangers. They'd been known to risk their lives to beings they'd never met, sacrifice resources they couldn't afford to lose, and tackle problems that any sensible species would avoid. They called themselves humans, and they were about to do something that would change how the entire galaxy thought about the impossible. The Zephyrian message was about to reach a little blue planet in an unremarkable solar system, where 8 billion beings were about to prove that sometimes the most irrational response is the most human one of all. Dr. Rebecca Walsh wasn't supposed to be the person who changed galactic history. She was just a tired communications officer pulling another double shift at Luna Station, Earth's primary deep space monitoring facility. The coffee had gone cold hours ago. Her eyes burned from staring at screens full of cosmic static, and she was counting down the minutes until her replacement arrived. That's when her equipment picked up something that made her heart skip a beat. At first, she thought it was equipment malfunction. The signal was too clean, too organized to be natural cosmic noise. But as she ran it through the translation protocols, her hands started shaking. This wasn't random space chatter or some pulsar doing its thing. This was a message encoded in mathematical principles that screamed intelligence, and it was screaming for help. Rebecca had spent 10 years monitoring space, listening to the endless whispers of the universe. She'd heard solar winds singing through gas clouds, detected the electromagnetic heartbeat of distant black holes, and cataloged thousands of natural phenomena. But she'd never heard anything like this. The message was desperate, beautiful, and utterly alien. It told the story of 30 million beings facing extinction, their sun dying, their time running out. Now, most people might have followed protocol. Fill out forms, submit reports, let the bureaucrats handle it through proper channels. But Rebecca Walsh had grown up in a family of firefighters and emergency responders. When someone was in trouble, you didn't waste time with paperwork. She stared at her screen for exactly 30 seconds, then did what humans always do when faced with the impossible. She picked up the phone. Her first call went to Dr. Benjamin Carter, head of xenobiology at the Lunar Research Institute. Ben had been asleep, but he was wide awake by the time Rebecca finished playing the message. Within an hour, every major scientist on Luna Station was crowded into Rebecca's tiny communications booth, watching the impossible unfold on her monitors. The signal was real. It was alien, and it was asking for help that nobody in the galaxy seemed willing to provide. The message reached Earth Command within 6 hours. By the next morning, it was sitting on the desk of every government leader on the planet. By noon, it had leaked to the news networks. By evening, 8 billion humans were staring at their screens, watching translations of an alien cry for help scroll across their televisions. The debate that followed was unlike anything in human history. Here was proof that humanity wasn't alone in the universe, and their first contact with alien intelligence was a desperate plea for rescue. The Terran council chambers had never seen such heated discussion. Politicians who usually couldn't agree on what to have for lunch were suddenly debating the future of an entire alien species. The arguments were brutal and honest. Humanity had barely figured out interstellar travel. Their fastest ships needed decades to cross between stars, burning massive amounts of fuel and resources that Earth's colonies desperately needed. The Mars colonies were still struggling with basic survival. The Europa mining stations required constant supply shipments. Earth itself was dealing with climate recovery projects that demanded enormous resources. General Patricia Stone laid out the hard facts. We got exactly 18 operational interstellar vessels, and most of them are already committed to supply runs. Our technology is primitive compared to what these Zephyrians probably have. If they can't save themselves, what makes us think we can? Economic advisor Dr. William Hayes ran the numbers for the council. A rescue mission of this scale would cost us every available resource. We'd have to strip our colonies bare, recall every ship, and gamble everything on a species we've never even met. But then Captain David Reynolds stepped forward. Reynolds was a legend in rescue operations, a man who'd spent 20 years pulling people out of impossible situations. His face was scarred from a mining accident on Titan. His hands bore the burns from a reactor fire on the Luna colony, and his service record read like a catalog of death-defying rescues. He didn't give a speech. He didn't quote statistics or argue economics. He just looked around that chamber full of politicians and bureaucrats and said something that cut through all the debate like a laser through steel. "I've pulled kids out of burning buildings knowing I might not make out alive," he said quietly. "I've gone into collapsed mines when everyone said it was hopeless. I've jumped into freezing oceans to save people I'd never met." He paused, letting his words sink in. The building's just bigger this time, but the job's the same. The silence in that chamber was deafening. Here was a man who'd made a career out of doing impossible things, and he was telling them this was just another rescue operation. Reynolds continued, his voice steady and calm. "We're human. This is what we do. We show up when nobody else will." The vote wasn't even close. It was unanimous. Earth was going to answer a call that nobody else in the galaxy would take. What happened next was probably the most insane engineering project in human history. 6 weeks to build a rescue fleet capable of crossing interstellar space and saving 30 million aliens. 6 weeks to do something that should have taken years, maybe decades. But humans have this weird habit of making impossible things happen when lives are on the line. Michael Torres hadn't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch since the project began. As head engineer at the Mars shipyards, he was used to impossible deadlines. But this was something else entirely. They were taking exploration vessels that were never designed for mass transport and somehow turning them into refugee ships. Torres stood in the main hangar bay, watching his team strip ships down to their bare metal skeletons. And he couldn't help but laugh at the insanity of it all. "We're basically rebuilding these ships from the inside out," he told his exhausted crew during one of their brief coffee breaks. Taking out scientific equipment, research labs, crew quarters, even some of the navigation systems to make room for refugee pods. The math was brutal. Each exploration ship was designed to carry maybe 50 people in comfort. They needed to pack in 10 times that number and keep them all alive for a 14-month journey through deep space. The refugee pods themselves were being manufactured around the clock in every facility on Earth, Mars, and the Moon colonies. These weren't luxury accommodations we're talking about. Think more like emergency medical pods crossed with deep freeze chambers. Each pod would keep one being alive and relatively comfortable for the duration of the journey, but they had to be designed for a species humanity had never even seen. That's where Dr. Jessica Kim came in. Kim was a xenobiologist who'd spent her career studying theoretical alien life forms, never imagining she'd actually meet any. Now, she was leading teams of scientists working around the clock to decode Zephyrian biology from fragments of their transmissions. Every scrap of data the aliens had sent was being analyzed, broken down, and rebuilt into life support specifications. "We're basically playing the galaxy's highest stakes guessing game," Kim explained to her team during one of their marathon sessions. "We know they're insectoid, we know their atmospheric requirements, and we know their approximate size. Everything else is educated guesswork." Her teams were designing air recycling systems for beings who might breathe differently than humans, temperature controls for creatures from a different world, and food systems for aliens whose dietary needs were completely unknown. The technical challenges were staggering. Chief Technician Robert Martinez was jury-rigging life support systems that had never been tested, combining human technology with alien specifications in ways that made veteran engineers nervous. "We're basically flying blind here," he admitted to his crew. "These systems work in theory, but we won't know for sure until we actually have aliens breathing our air and eating our food." Meanwhile, Captain Angela Foster was overseeing the conversion of the fleet's largest vessel, the exploration ship New Horizon. Foster had commanded deep space missions for 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for this. They were stripping out entire decks to install massive cargo holds filled with prefabricated habitats, emergency medical stations, and enough supplies to support a small city for over a year. The ships that finally rolled out of Earth's shipyards looked nothing like the sleek exploration vessels they'd started as. They were bulky, overcrowded, and held together by what Foster jokingly called determination and duct tape. Every safety margin had been pushed to the breaking point. The fusion drives were running hotter than recommended. The life support systems were operating at maximum capacity before they even launched. The navigation computers were handling calculations they'd never been designed for. But somehow, it was all coming together. The human capacity for organized chaos was on full display as thousands of workers, scientists, and engineers collaborated on the impossible. Supply ships from every colony in the solar system converged on Earth, carrying rare materials, spare parts, and anything else the mission might need. Volunteers worked triple shifts without complaint. Families donated personal belongings to be converted into alien care packages. The emotional weight of the mission wasn't lost on anyone. Every person working on the project knew they were gambling everything on a species they'd never met. Behind them, 8 billion humans watched the news feeds with a mixture of pride and terror. This was humanity's first real test as a spacefaring civilization, and they were staking everything on their ability to care about strangers. The math was terrifying and simple. The Zephyrian star would collapse in 16 months. Humanity's fastest ships, pushed to their absolute limits, needed 14 months just to reach the alien homeworld. That left 2 months to evacuate 30 million beings and get them to safety. 2 months to save an entire civilization with ships that were overcrowded, underpowered, and running on equipment stretched far beyond its design limits. As the rescue fleet prepared for launch, everyone involved knew they were attempting something that bordered on madness. But it was a kind of madness that defined humanity. The kind that said impossible was just another word for challenging. When the human rescue fleet finally dropped out of hyperspace 14 months later, the sight that greeted them was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The Zephyrian system was painted in shades of red and orange, bathed in the angry light of a dying star. Their sun, once a steady yellow beacon, now pulsed and flickered like a candle struggling against the wind. Solar flares erupted from its surface in massive arcs, sending deadly radiation cascading across the planets that had once been safely within its warm embrace. Below them, the Zephyrian homeworld looked like a planet-sized anthill that had been kicked over. Millions of insectoid beings moved across the surface in desperate, organized chaos. Through their telescopes, the human crews could see massive construction sites where the aliens were working frantically on evacuation ships that would clearly never be finished in time. Half-built vessels sat in enormous shipyards, their skeletal frames reaching toward the sky like the bones of some prehistoric creature. Captain Robert Hayes, commanding the lead vessel, felt his heart sink as he took in the scope of the situation. "There's no way their ships will be ready," he told his bridge crew quietly. "Look at those construction sites. They'd need another 5 years minimum." The Zephyrians had the right idea, but they simply didn't have enough time. Their technology was impressive, but building evacuation vessels for 30 million beings was a task that would challenge even the most advanced civilization. First contact happened in a way that nobody had expected. The Zephyrians had been monitoring space for any sign of help, and when the human ships appeared on their sensors, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The aliens' first transmission came through as a burst of mathematical symbols that the human computers quickly translated. But you didn't need a translator to understand the emotion behind it. Dr. Patricia Williams, the fleet's lead xenobiologist, was monitoring the communications when the first images came through. What she saw nearly brought her to tears. Zephyrian faces filled the transmission screens. Compound eyes that reflected light like jewels, mandibles clicking with excitement, and what could only be described as tears of gratitude streaming down alien cheeks. "Someone came," the translation read. Someone actually came. The emotional impact hit every human in the fleet like a physical blow. These weren't just alien beings sending signals. These were families, children, elderly creatures who had given up hope and suddenly found it again. Commander Lisa Rodriguez, coordinating the relief effort from the flagship, had to pause for a moment to compose herself before addressing her crews. "All right, people," she said over the fleet-wide communication system. "Let's show them what humans do best." What followed was probably the most impressive display of organized chaos in galactic history. The humans got to work with that stubborn efficiency that had carried their species through ice ages, world wars, and every natural disaster their planet could throw at them. Supply ships moved like clockwork, unloading prefabricated habitats and emergency shelters faster than the laws of physics should have allowed. Engineering teams worked alongside Zephyrian construction crews, adapting human technology to alien needs in real time. Medical Officer James Wright found himself facing challenges no human doctor had ever encountered. How do you perform emergency surgery on a being with 6 limbs and compound eyes? He muttered to his team while setting up field hospitals. How do you check the pulse of something with 3 hearts? But Wright spent 20 years in emergency medicine, and he approached alien biology the same way he approached everything else, with determination and what his nurses politely called creative problem-solving. The cultural exchange happened organically as humans and Zephyrians worked side by side. Language barriers crumbled as both species discovered that pointing, gesturing, and shared determination could communicate more than words. Human engineers learned to work with alien tools, while Zephyrian workers marveled at human improvisation techniques that their methodical minds had never considered. But as the evacuation progressed, the terrible math became clear. There weren't enough ships. There were never enough ships. Even with the human vessels and the partially completed Zephyrian craft, they were looking at transporting 30 million beings with space for maybe 20 million. Any sane species would have done the math, prioritized the most important individuals, and left the rest behind. Humanity, of course, was not sane. Commander Rodriguez stood before her assembled captains and laid out the situation with brutal honesty. "We're going to pack these ships beyond any reasonable capacity," she announced. "We're going to sleep in shifts, share rations meant for half our number, and somehow find room for just one more family." She paused, looking at each captain in turn. "Anyone have a problem with that?" Not a single hand was raised. What followed was a masterclass in human stubbornness. Crews gave up their quarters to house alien families. Food replicators worked around the clock to produce meals suitable for insectoid digestive systems. Life support systems groaned under loads they were never designed to handle, but somehow kept functioning through a combination of advanced engineering and what the technicians call mechanical sympathy. As the Zephyrian star began its final death throes, casting the entire system in eerie crimson light, the last transport ship lifted away from the dying world. The viewports were packed with Zephyrian children, their compound eyes wide with wonder and fear as they watched their homeworld shrink beneath them. And there, floating beside them in zero gravity, human crew members sang lullabies in languages the young aliens couldn't understand but somehow found comforting anyway. 30 million beings had been saved by a species that barely knew how to save itself. The aftermath of the Zephyrian rescue was something nobody had planned for, least of all the humans who'd pulled it off. When the massive refugee fleet finally limped into human space, overcrowded and running on fumes, everyone expected the usual post-crisis problems. Refugee camps, resource shortages, cultural conflicts, and all the messy complications that come with suddenly having 30 million alien guests. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The Zephyrians didn't become refugees in human space. They became family. It started small, the way most revolutionary changes do. Dr. Amanda Foster, a linguistic professor at New Geneva University, was assigned to help Zephyrian children learn human languages. She expected language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, maybe some homesickness for their lost world. What she found instead were kids who picked up human customs faster than she could teach them, who played games that transcended species boundaries, and who called her Aunt Amanda within weeks of their first meeting. The adult Zephyrians were equally adaptable, but in ways that amazed human observers. Engineer Thomas Clark was working with a group of Zephyrian technicians to adapt their technology for human use when he realized something incredible. "They're not just learning our methods," he reported to his supervisors. "They're improving them. These guys see engineering problems from angles we never considered." Within 6 months, Zephyrian human engineering teams were revolutionizing everything from space travel to food production. The aliens' compound eyes could perceive structural stresses that human vision missed entirely. Their methodical, hive-like thinking complemented human creativity in ways that produced breakthrough after breakthrough. Space stations that should have taken years to build were completed in months. Medical treatments that had puzzled human doctors for decades were solved when Zephyrian biological insights met human determination. But the real magic happened in the small moments. Human families opened their homes to Zephyrian refugees, despite the obvious challenges of different biologies and customs. Kids from both species played together in parks across the solar system, creating games that required 6 limbs and compound eyes to play properly. Elderly humans found themselves teaching alien children how to garden, while Zephyrian elders shared stories of their lost world with human audiences who hung on every translated word. The galaxy, meanwhile, was watching all of this with growing amazement and concern. Word of the rescue had spread through galactic communication networks like wildfire. The story was too incredible to ignore. A primitive species had somehow pulled off the largest rescue operation in recorded history, saving an entire civilization that the galaxy's major powers had written off as a lost cause. But the aftermath was what really caught everyone's attention. Ambassador Helen Martinez, humanity's first official representative to the Galactic Council, found herself fielding communication requests from species that had ignored human first contact attempts for decades. The Crystalline Collective, who had previously dismissed humans as aesthetically uninteresting, suddenly wanted to establish cultural exchange programs. The Void Walkers, masters of interdimensional travel, began sending trade delegations to human space for the first time in history. Even more surprising were the delegations from species that had never made contact with anyone. The Silent Rings, ancient beings who communicated through gravitational wave manipulation, sent their first message to another species in over 1,000 years. It was addressed specifically to humanity and translated roughly to, "We wish to understand your motivation." The cold, calculating hegemony was having the biggest adjustment problems. For centuries, they'd run the galaxy like a massive corporation, making decisions based purely on cost-benefit analysis and resource management. Their computer models could predict the behavior of every known species with remarkable accuracy. But suddenly, they had to account for a new variable in their equations: the knowledge that somewhere out there was a species crazy enough to cross the galaxy just because somebody asked for help. Hegemony analysts spent months trying to understand human psychology. They studied the rescue mission from every angle, ran countless simulations, and interviewed thousands of human subjects. Their conclusion was disturbing from their perspective. Humans appear to operate on principles that made no economic sense whatsoever. They would sacrifice resources they couldn't afford to lose for people they'd never met. They would risk their own lives for complete strangers. They would choose the expensive, dangerous option if it meant helping others, even when the logical choice was clearly to walk away. This makes them completely unpredictable, reported Chief Analyst Designation 7741 to the Hegemony High Council. Their decision-making process appears to be influenced by emotional factors that we cannot quantify. They represent a fundamental disruption to galactic stability. But it wasn't just the major powers taking notice. In archives across a dozen worlds, alien historians were opening new files. These weren't the usual records of military capability, economic potential, or technological advancement. These files were marked simply human, and they contained something the galaxy hadn't seen in a very long time: records of a species that put compassion ahead of profit. The eternal archive keepers, being so old they remembered the birth of most current civilizations, made an unprecedented decision. They classified humanity as a catalyst species, a designation reserved for civilizations that fundamentally changed the galactic status quo. The last species to earn that designation had been the original founders of the Galactic Council itself. Over 10,000 years ago, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, the communications officer who'd first detected the Zephyrian distress call, found herself at the center of galactic attention she'd never wanted. Reporters from dozens of species wanted to interview the human who'd started it all, but she always gave the same answer: "I just picked up the phone." Any human would have done the same thing. That statement, translated into 100 different languages and broadcast across the galaxy, became something like humanity's unofficial motto. And for the first time in galactic history, other species were starting to wonder if maybe they should try picking up the phone too.